Hey guys, Nike here. Since the feature patch in April, our theorycraft sophistication has improved significantly. The most important change was our understanding of the importance of vulnerability stacking to overall team DPS. While we always understood that maxing out vulnerability at 25 stacks was important, our previous analysis always determined the optimal DPS build assuming 25 vulnerability stacks as a given. However, there are almost no non-engineered team comps that can permanently maintain 25 vulnerability stacks against boss mobs. What this means is that almost every team comp, no matter what you come up with, will be chronically short of vulnerability, and the longer the fight, the more short of vulnerability the team comps will be. As a result, the optimal build in most cases is not the build that has the highest DPS at 25 vulnerability. It is the build that has the best DPS while also maximizing its capability to produce vulnerability stacks. For example, if build A gets 12,000 DPS and makes 3 stacks of vuln, it is less optimal than a build that makes only 11,750 DPS but provides 6 stacks of vulnerability. Assuming your party would make use of the additional 3 stacks, of course. But as I said, almost every party would make use of those extra stacks. For our part, we have found it is more useful to calculate DPS without any vulnerability considered, except for the vulnerability that the build itself can provide. We call this vulnerability adjusted DPS. This vulnerability adjusted DPS paints a significantly more accurate picture of what the builds are actually doing in game. This revised analysis has led us to abandon some of our previously held beliefs and to arrive at some very different conclusions. Unlike Might, Banner of Strength, Banner of Discipline, and Fury, vulnerability is difficult to maximize, and even more difficult to maximize permanently. The other team buffs are trivial and can be taken for granted in any semi-organized team. Vulnerability cannot be. All DPS numbers referenced in the remainder of my guide will assume Banners, Might, and Fury for givens. It only assumes Empowered Allies for Empowered Allies builds for reasons that we will discuss later. Our second conclusion is that Empower Allies itself is only marginally useful. In very rough terms, an Empower Ally build is approximately 1500 DPS less than a true DPS warrior build. However, Empowered Allies buffs the team under optimal conditions by about 2000 DPS. This net gain for the party is very small, and suboptimal parties won't actually gain anything at all. As a result of this analysis, we can only recommend Empowered Allies builds for groups that are trying to min-max perfectly, which would be the case for speedrun records or boss kill time records. We do not feel that Empowered Allies is an appropriate build to run for casual runs or pickup groups. Based on our conclusions, there are 2 optimal warrior builds and 3 other close to optimal builds that do have imperfections. I will briefly discuss all 5 before going into detail individually later in the video. The primary build is the main warrior build, and it is a DPS build focusing on providing maximal personal DPS while also contributing excellent amounts of vulnerability stacks. It's a versatile build that operates well in organized groups and pugs. The theoretical max DPS of this build is below the pure greatsword build, but it provides significantly more vulnerability. So for almost any group, it will actually provide the highest overall team DPS. The second build is a Pure Axe Empowered Allies build. Previous Empowered Allies builds using Greatsword possessed slightly higher personal DPS, but they did lack a significant amount of vulnerability stacking. There were many situations where Empowered Allies would boost the overall DPS of your party by around 4%, but since you were losing 4 stacks of vulnerability, the end result was that you were actually breaking even on team DPS and were not maximized properly. The Pure Axe Empowered Allies build provides the same team boosting capabilities of Empowered Allies while also keeping thought to maximizing the amount of vulnerability stacks. The next 2 builds are the Pure Axe DPS and Pure Greatsword DPS builds, which are flawed in different but equally important ways. The Pure Axe build makes the highest vulnerability stacks for any warrior build, but its personal DPS is low enough that even with the vulnerability adjusted, it's suboptimal compared to other choices. The pure Greatsword build, on the other hand, has the greatest potential DPS of any warrior build under optimal conditions. However, it is extremely weak in vulnerability stacking, and when other builds are adjusted for their ability to stack vulnerability, the pure Greatsword build does come up a bit short. It does bear to mention that in a party that can hit the vulnerability cap easily, such as a party with an engineer, a pure Greatsword build is capable of providing optimal DPS. The last build is a Phalanx Strength build. It sacrifices significant personal DPS for the ability to stack might for the entire party. Previous iterations of this build used the Greatsword DPS rotation. However, extremely weak vulnerability stacking resulted and caused team DPS to be decreased overall. The only reasonable way to play a non-detrimental Phalanx Strength build is to use fast hands with an Axe Mace on swap. This will sacrifice a small amount of the might stacking capability in order to provide reasonable vulnerability production. This build is only truly acceptable for pickup groups with little coordination, and within that genre, it's only acceptable for team comps that have severe might deficiencies. Such a team comp would not normally include an elementalist, an engineer, or other warriors. The presence of other might-generating classes makes the marginal value of Phalanx Strength significantly reduced. In regards to the gear for the builds I cover, the gear I recommend is Berserker with Scholar Runes. The exception to Scholar Runes will be for the Phalanx Strength build, which benefits greatly from Strength Runes. The recent nerf to Strength Runes makes them suboptimal for organized teams. Additionally, many, if not all builds, there is some amount of Assassin's gear that will result in absolutely optimal DPS production. However, what is optimal depends on which food you use and whether or not you have a ranger in your party. Since it's very easy to change food, and since rangers come and go, I find it best to recommend full Berserker stats on all gear. The difference from the most optimal Assassin's mix to Berserkers is rarely ever greater than 1%, and in most cases it is less than 1/100th of a percent. This makes recommending full Berserker gear easier, and it allows me to suggest optimal foods for each build with confidence. As far as infusions go, in almost every case, precision infusions are superior. However, this can change depending on which food you use and whether or not a ranger is in your party, like I said above. My recommendation is to use precise infusions. However, the difference between precise and mighty is relatively small, and I would not recommend overriding any existing mighty infusions you may have. At a minimum, you need the following gear to be considered a well-equipped warrior. A greatsword with a 10% sigil and a 5% sigil, an axe with a 10% sigil, and a mace with sigil of battle. Additionally, I recommend having a sword with sigil of battle, a longbow with a 10% sigil and a 5% sigil, and an underwater spear with a 10% sigil and a 5% sigil. Additionally, if you're a true min-maxer, you're going to want a sword with an energy sigil, which is good for boss solos, as well as certain difficult fractal bosses, such as the Archdiviner, where additional dodges may come in handy, or the legendary Dredge Power Suit, or legendary Ice Elemental. I recommend carrying a Warhorn for mobility. You could use Sigil of Battle on it if you feel that you may be in combat with it on, or Sigil of Energy if you're using it solely for trash runs. I recommend carrying a backup Greatsword with Sigil of Frailty in place of the Night Sigil, so for daytime dungeons you can inflict extra vulnerability, where the Night Sigil would not work. Additionally, I would recommend keeping a backup Greatsword with Undead Slaying, and a backup axe with Undead Slaying for when you do a Raw, which most true dedicated dungeon runners will do quite often. And that is it for the basics of gear. There are other items that you can keep in your inventory that will come up in niche situations. However, when it comes to weapons, those are the mains that you'll need to run all of these builds in an optimal fashion. So the first build is the main warrior build. This is a standard DPS build. In strength, the traits we select are dual wielding, slashing power, and berserker's power. In arms, we'll take rending strikes and forceful greatsword. And in discipline, we'll take signet mastery. If you are using sigil, or if you're using battle standard as your elite, change signet mastery to warrior sprint. The goal of this build is to maximize personal DPS by utilizing the greatsword burst skills on cooldown, while using fast hands to swap to Axe Mace to gain access to the superior vulnerability stacking capabilities of that set. While this build has a slightly lower maximum potential DPS than the pure Greatsword build, and slightly lower vulnerability stacking capabilities compared to pure Axe, it is good enough at each task to be more optimal in most situations, making it more optimal overall than either build. For this particular build, for food, I recommend bowls of curry butternut squash soup. Additionally, if you have a ranger in your party, I would recommend that you use plates of Orion truffle steak. For the Pure Axe Empowered Allies build, the trait spread we use is 46040. In strength, we will take dual wielding and axe mastery. In arms, deep strike, rending strikes, and dual wield agility. In tactics, we'll take empowered and empowered allies. The trait spread 46040 produces similar DPS results to the pure Greatsword variant of Empowered Allies, but however, it produces an additional 4 stacks of vulnerability over the pure Greatsword build. When the extra 4 stacks are taken into consideration, this is a significantly more powerful build than the Greatsword version. For this build, the optimal food I recommend is sweet and spicy butternut squash soup. If you don't feel like spending the gold that this soup would require on a regular basis, you can use the cheaper alternative of plates of truffle steak. Next we have the Failing Strength Warrior build. This is a 05063 Greatsword and Axe Mace build. In arms we take Rending Strikes and Forceful Greatsword. In tactics we take Empowered, Empowered Allies, and Failing Strength. And then in Discipline we take Signet Mastery. This trait selection produces slightly less DPS than the 06062 variation, but it produces approximately 4 additional stacks of vulnerability, which makes it superior build in almost every context to the pure Greatsword version. As a full support build, sacrificing many stacks of vulnerability to slightly buff might makes less sense than reducing the might stacks a little bit to significantly buff vulnerability. Bottom line, this trait spread for the Failing Strength build will increase your team's DPS by a greater amount than the alternative. For this build, when it comes to food, I recommend plates of truffle steak as the primary food. This build has a significantly lower power than other warrior builds, so the power will boost your DPS by a significant amount, as well as adding the precision that will give you more might stacks when you crit with your Greatsword. The first DPS rotation I want to cover is the Greatsword Axe Mace rotation. This rotation is good for both the Greatsword Axe Mace DPS build as well as the Failing Strength build. The key to this is utilizing your Greatsword burst skills 2 through 5 on cooldown, making especially sure to maximize your 100 Blades and Whirlwind attack as they are your most powerful attacks. While these are on cooldown, you'll swap to Axe Mace, utilize your Vuln skills as often as possible without interrupting your auto attack chain, as well as using Tremor whenever possible for the additional DPS boost it gives. The way this works will maximize your Vuln stacking as well as your DPS in a way that produces a large net gain for your overall team DPS. The next build I'm going to demonstrate with the rotation is the Pure Axe Empowered Allies build. The way this build works, you want to use your Vuln skills as much as possible, making sure to hit your Tremor with 2 targets as much as possible, and utilizing your Eviscerate on cooldown when you maximize your Adrenaline. Additionally, when your Mace 4 skill and Tremor is on cooldown, you can switch to Impale, and Impale followed by an auto attack chain followed by a Rip will maximize your DPS. One thing to consider is never interrupt your chop, double chop and triple chop, as you will cost yourself significant DPS. The rotation, a brief example, will be as follows. So that's it, guys. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this build, and I hope you like the changes to the warrior from the theory crafting that we've done. And I want to give a special shout out to everyone who's helped me refine what we've been doing. First and foremost is DeKeys in my guild, along with other people that participate with us in our theorycraft forum on dtguilds.com. I would encourage anyone who wants to learn more about the game, to improve, or even contribute, to come to our website and post on our Theorycraft forums any ideas you have or any tests that you've done, and get constructive criticism, good feedback, and hopefully everyone will learn and improve. So again, thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the comments.